Center for Marxist. Okay. So welcome again. I'm Wadia Halabi, one of the volunteers at the Center for Marxist Education. Also co-sponsoring this event are the Claudia Jones School for Political Education in Washington, D.C., and the Oakland-based Institute for Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library. And we want to thank the Cambridge Public Library and Kenny Mascari of the library for hosting us. This is our first in-person event in 19 months. And the center recently had to move out of our historic space of nearly 50 years as the building undergoes renovations and we fear gentrification. About the center and Burlak, the Red Flame was at the founding of the Center for Marxist Education 5 decades ago. She figures in struggles that all three of our speakers have studied. She was a textile mill worker at the age of 14 in Pennsylvania and a union leader by the age of 17, and imprisoned dozens and arrested and imprisoned dozens and dozens of times, once facing the death penalty. She was involved in the Communist Party's Southern strategy that included international labor defense, sharecropper organizing, but her main focus was organizing industrial workers. And I was very fortunate, as several of us here, I think, were in overlapping with her. She died in 2002. One of our speakers today, Robin Kelley, will introduce the other two speakers. The focus of our discussion today is the developments that led to the Tulsa atrocity in 1921. And as probably most of you know, in 1921, the Klan, the police, and oil company planes essentially joined forces to bomb and burn down Tulsa's black section. So day after, images of Tulsa resemble images from Gaza after Israeli bombing. There was some yesterday. I lived in Gaza as a youth, briefly, after being pushed out of Palestine in 1948. And as you probably know, there's a history of identification and solidarity between the Palestinian, Black, and Indigenous movements. And all three of our speakers have been very much involved in Palestine solidarity. In the November 2010 issue of Monthly Review, which was attached to some but not all mailings about today's event, two of our speakers, it's written by two of our speakers, and it's about conditions, the explosive conditions in Oklahoma in 1917. So it limits itself to that year by and large. But it describes what to me were astonishing, extraordinary movements and struggles by workers, sharecroppers, and tenant farmers in Oklahoma that year, Black, Indigenous, and white. And so it appears to me that a variety of errors and failures by these movements, and maybe we can get to this, but it appears to me that the failures, weaknesses of these movements are behind their inability to prevent what happened in Tulsa in 1921, or at least to organize a defense. And this must have happened largely between 1917 and 1921. And again, inexperience and errors by the movement's leaders appears to me to have opened the path for that crazed campus reaction that was the attack on Greenwood. Richard Levins, the great Marxist scientist and an architect of ecological agriculture in Cuba, and a good friend of the Center for Marxist Education, essentially outlined approaches to how to correct errors by our movement. And his approach was not to demonize leaders who made the errors, but to ask what problems were those leaders trying to solve that they solved incorrectly. Who made the errors and why did they make them? So that's the methodology, one that I very much appreciate. We may not be able to resolve, even begin to approach identifying the errors, even the major errors and problems that made possible the atrocity in Tulsa. But hopefully today can be a start, along with all of the facts that will that should come out today. So let me pass this to Robin Kelley. We're so happy to have him with us, and he will introduce the two speakers, and he will moderate. If he gets tired, we have backups, so just put a hand or something.
Yeah, it is not necessary. Well, thank you so much for that. And if actually, I thought we were here to resolve all the contradictions and errors of the class struggle for the last 500 years. But, you know, I guess what we could do in 2 hours. So let me just open up with a few remarks to frame our discussion. And then I have the honor of introducing two amazing, amazing scholars. But, you know, as all of you know, we spent the first half of this year really commemorating the Tulsa massacre with panels and workshops and documentary films. The president and vice president had some apologetic things to say about it. Of course, no apologies for stealing the indigenous land that made Tulsa possible, but that's part of the story we're going to talk about. Everything in our kind of collective discussion centered on Black Wall Street and the question of reparations. And I remember feeling really frustrated and scratching my head because it seemed like the only people that mattered in the discourse and the conversation were wealthy Black families. Because Black Wall Street, you know, which made up just a few blocks of this 35 to 40 square block section of part of Greenwood that was leveled, that the rest of Greenwood didn't matter, you know, and all we really heard about were doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs and Black-owned theaters and a luxurious Stratford hotel, when in fact, the vast majority of Black Tulsans who were beaten, killed, displaced were working people. Most Black Tulsans were porters and janitors, gardeners, chauffeurs, domestics. And I kept asking the question out loud to some people's annoyance, when we speak of reparations, what's worth more, the price of a Black-owned luxury hotel or the life of a porter who worked there? So there was so much missing from the conversation. So we're going to have a different kind of conversation today, you know, thinking about how the history of indigenous dispossession is tied to the 1921 massacre. What does it mean that Tulsa's great wealth came from oil? And this is very, very important. It's amazing how oil, in the success of Negroes in Tulsa, oil didn't come up at all. How do we reconcile Oklahoma's radical history of working class rebellion, often across race, ethnicity, and nation, and this pogrom? What are the class politics? And what happened after the bombs dropped, which is something to think about today after we're, you know, commemorating another violent destruction of Hiroshima. So to help us navigate these and other questions, we have two really distinguished historians, radical thinkers, who have been asking these important questions all along. And in fact, one, as Mr. Halibi made clear, one of the important provocations for this conversation is their essay from Monthly Review from 2010 called Dreams of Revolution, Oklahoma 1917, which is a story that we don't always talk about in the context of 1921, and that's a jointly written essay. So let me just introduce our guests. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is an historian, writer, professor emeritus at California State University, whom I proudly call a friend and comrade. She was born and raised in Oklahoma and has deep roots in the region's radical history, and you could read about it in her memoir, Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie. She holds all kinds of degrees, PhDs, MFAs, diplomas, but perhaps the most important education comes from her movement work, being active in the American Indian movement and the International Indian Treaty Council, a feminist, anti-war activist, a key figure in Central American solidarity movements, defending the rights of Mosquito Indians, among other things. And you can read about it in her books, Outlaw Woman, a memoir of the war years, and Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War. She's the author or editor of 15 books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, 1680 to 1980, and her landmark American award-winning book from 2014, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, as well as Loaded, Disarming History of the Second Amendment, a disarming history of the Second Amendment, and her forthcoming, which is coming out basically within the month, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and the History of Exclusion and Erasure. And as all of you know, if you've been watching Raoul Peck's HBO series, Exterminate All the Brutes, it's based largely on her work, and she also is featured in that series. Professor John Womack Jr. Is the Robert Woods Bliss Professor of Latin American History and Economics at Harvard, now emeritus. He is perhaps best known for his classic and still extremely relevant and powerful book, Zapata and the Zapata and the Mexican Revolution, which first appeared in 1968 and really established him as the leading American Marxist historian of Mexico, which the New York Times found to be a kind of curiosity, but that's a badge of honor. He went on to publish groundbreaking essays on the Mexican working class and the economy, edited the widely circulated Chiapas in Rebellion and Historical Reader, and in 2011, the New Press released his book, The Revolution That Wasn't, Mexico 1910 to 1920. Of course, what's not talked about always with Professor Womack's work is that, like Roxanne, Professor Dunbar-Ortiz, he was also born in Oklahoma and wrote his undergraduate thesis on the Green Corn Rebellion, which of course is part of the subject of what happens in 1917. So with that, I will turn it over to Roxanne, and we will jump right in.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for that generous introduction. And thanks to Wadi Halibi and the Center for Marxist Education, the Claudia Jones School, the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library, and others for organizing this important and timely event. And especially thank you for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure and really an honor to be speaking along with comrade historians John Womack and Robin Kelley, both of whom I admire tremendously and learn from. Well, I'm not a specialist in Oklahoma history, but I learned about the period we're talking about, 1917 to 21, from my father, who was 15 in 1917. His father, my grandfather, a veterinarian and farmer, Scots-Irish, was active in the Oklahoma Socialist Party from its founding. My grandfather also carried the card of the Industrial Workers of the World. It used to hang in the living room I grew up in. This is, of course, the Wobblies. And he named my father after the IWW leaders who were on trial in Boise, Idaho in August 1907 when he was born. These names made up my father's name on his birth certificate. He loved to show it to me. Moyer, Haywood, Scarberry, Pettibone, Dunbar. He knew the life stories of each of those revolutionaries that he had learned from his father. He also told me of the Klan violence against his family, having to take turns on watch duty at night, finally forcing my grandfather to move his family to San Antonio. My father stayed behind, and I grew up in that town. The May 2020 centennial of the destruction of the thriving Greenwood district of Tulsa, the site often called Black Wall Street, and its destruction, the Tulsa race riot, was an opportunity to put the catastrophe on the map of white supremacy and Black oppression in the United States. It was an amazing learning experience for many. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter led protests. However, in media reports, there was little in the way of explanation of just how the Greenwood district came to be a thriving and prosperous phenomenon during the height of Jim Crow America. I'm sometimes amazed how little curiosity there is in the media to ask someone that question. Eli Grayson, a descendant of Muskogee Creek Black freedmen, rightly says that any history that tries to tell the story of Black Wall Street without telling the story of the Black Indian freedmen and their land is a flop. They're missing the point of what caused the wealth, the foundation of the wealth. So I would like to tell a brief version of that history. I study, write, and teach on European colonialism, and in particular settler colonialism in the United States. And I do believe that Oklahoma is a unique case in the 3-century violent process of Anglo-settler colonialism that created the continental United States. With the 1803 acquisition of the Trans-Mississippi Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson envisioned a part of it to be what he called, in his words, Indian colonization zone. That is, a place for forcibly resettling the survivors of US wars against Native nations in order to seize their property, primarily for vast cotton plantations worked by enslaved Black people. The Cotton Kingdom creating racial capitalism. In 1825, President Andrew Jackson designated those lands west of the Mississippi Indian country, which was narrowed down to Indian territory that encompassed most of what became the states of Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and part of Iowa, subsequently narrowed down to the eastern half of Oklahoma. Then the present parameters. What is today eastern Oklahoma constituted the resettlement geography for the so-called 5 civilized tribes that had descended from the ancient agrarian population of the southeast of the continent. One of the 7 sites of the origins of agriculture in the world, around 8,000. Year 8,000 BC. So these are the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Muskogee Seminole nations, whose homelands had once spanned what became the Confederacy. The land they came to occupy in Indian Territory had been forcibly taken by the US government from the Plains Native people who already lived there for thousands of years. and force them onto small reservations on the periphery. So they really made of these people settlers, settler colonialism, without their desire to be such. They wanted to stay where they were. During the 18th century, with Anglos dominating the eastern seaboard and with legalized racial slavery in full force, plus the diligent work of Protestant missionaries, these indigenous agrarians in the South had adopted Anglo practices, replacing subsistent food crops with cotton and acquiring enslaved Africans for labor. Upon the forced removal in the 1830s and 1840s to Indian Territory, horrible, horrible events, a trail of tears, along with them, and also suffering, were the people they called property. By the time of the Civil War, a minority of the Native nations' citizens owned around 10,000 enslaved Black people who gained freedom with the end of legalized slavery and became citizens of each of the Native nations. During the Civil War, the 5 nations in eastern Oklahoma, Indian Territory, were as divided as the United States in supporting the Union or the Confederacy, and volunteers fought on both sides. And many Black Indians escaped slavery and joined the Union Army. And most of them came back home and had, their citizenship in the tribes. By 1860, about 14% of the total population of that tribal territory in eastern Oklahoma were Black people enslaved by tribal members. After the Civil War, the Black tribal freedmen held millions of acres in common with other tribal members and later with forced government allotments of the communal lands in the 1890s in large individual allotments. Property ownership gave the freedmen stability and economic prosperity, unlike Black people in the South, whose promised 40 acres and a mule was squelched by the premature end of Reconstruction and the birth of the terrorist Ku Klux Klan, as well, and the rapid imposition of Jim Crow. 50 rural Black towns founded by Black freedmen from the 5 nations thrived in eastern Oklahoma. There are about 13 left today, while Greenwood in Tulsa was a vibrant urban center for all. Economic stability allowed Black freedmen, Black Indian freedmen in Oklahoma to start businesses, farms, and ranches, some of which had oil wells, and helped to give rise to the prosperous Greenwood district in Tulsa. The land that Greenwood and all of Tulsa sat on had collectively belonged to the Muskogee Creek Nation before allotment. By the turn of the century, the prosperity of the Black Indian communities attracted Black migrants from the South, who actually made up many of those all Black towns. Not everyone was wealthy, of course. In fact, the majority were not wealthy, as Robin pointed out. Most Black women and men in Greenwood had day jobs for businesses there in the 3 blocks of Greenwood, of course, but also in house and groundskeeping for the super rich white families in Tulsa. But at home in Greenwood, they did have access to schools. Their children could go to school. They had playgrounds, banks, hotels, restaurants to work in, to also patronize. No one was hungry, no homeless people. Financial stability allowed Black Native American freedmen a kind of freedom that Black people in the South, even W.B. Du Bois, just marveled over. And the financial stability allowed them to start just there in Greenwood alone, 200 some businesses. So after the destruction of Greenwood, Black freedmen and many other American Indian citizens rapidly lost land and money to unscrupulous or careless white guardians that were assigned to them, that were imposed. They had property taxes because allotment had a few years in trust, but then became private property. So they had property taxes. Also white scams, accidents, and racist policies and laws. They also made business mistakes or had bad luck, just like any property owners. Some who had oil wells on their property found them burned down. Historian Elena Roberts, who is descended from Black Chickasaw freedmen, points out that if freed Black people all over, including in Eastern Oklahoma, had received reparations after the Civil War, also, of course, military occupation, assaults like the destruction of Greenwood show that they would have needed years of US troop deployments to protect them, given the angry resentment of white people at seeing Black people with money or with success or education. Black prosperity was precisely what the elite of Tulsa could not tolerate. Tulsa was the capital of the burgeoning oil industry in the United States. Oklahoma was dubbed the Saudi Arabia of America. Violence came from the top and didn't begin with the destruction of Greenwood. Along with oil drilling, mining, and agribusiness, great wealth was created for white people. The greatest wealth was created for white people in Oklahoma, and none of it trickled down. It produced a mean, vicious ruling class, still a mean, vicious ruling class in Oklahoma today, equal to the corporate giants of the East. Workers, old white settlers, as well as immigrants, especially Italian, Eastern European, Polish, Czech, tramped from field to mine to oil fields, joining the IWW and the Socialist Party and the more radical Working Men's Party, which Jack will tell you more about. W. Tate Brady was one of Tulsa's founders, is considered, his founder, the founder. Even today, the Brady name is attached to Tulsa's elite landmarks, the Brady Theater, the Brady's Art District, the Brady's Heights, streets named after Brady. According to the Oklahoma Historical Society's Encyclopedia of Oklahoma, Tate Brady was a pioneer, entrepreneur, member of the Oklahoma Bar, politician, and an early booster of Tulsa. Less mentioned is Brady's work to segregate Tulsa and his deep involvement with the Ku Klux Klan and affiliated organizations. Along with Tulsa's chief of police, Ed Lucas, Brady instigated the kidnapping and torture, tarring and feathering and expulsion of Tulsa Wobblies in 1917, 3 months after the crushing of the Green Corn Rebellion, the uprising of Black, white, and Muskogee tenant farmers against conscription, which John Womack will talk about more. After the arrest of the Wobblies, Lucas and Brady turned them over to the Black-robed Knights of Liberty, a precursor of the Ku Klux Klan. The day after the torture of the Wobblies, the Tulsa World newspaper headline screamed, "Modern Ku Klux Klan comes into being. 17 first victims, black-robed Knights of Liberty. Taking prisoners from the police to the lonely ravine. The Klan didn't officially arrive in Oklahoma until 1920, when they registered in the state. But as far back as 1907, there were reported incidents of extra-legal activities by so-called white cappers. The year before the Klan arrived in 1919, Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General Palmer carried out raids all over the country to destroy workers' organizations, including in Oklahoma, imprisoning those who were citizens and deporting the foreign-born. By 1918, extra-legal violence, including lynchings, had spread throughout the state and had appeared to gain a quiet acceptance and collaboration among law enforcement, politicians, and business leaders. And during this heated period of racial tension, Tate Brady and the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce brought in the Sons of Confederate Veterans 28th annual reunion to town. Back then, the Sons of Confederate Veterans weren't merely a benign Civil War enactment club, as it is so often portrayed in today's media and in Tulsa. One of its organizing principles was and remains the, quote, emulation of the Confederate veterans' virtues and the perpetuation of those principles he loved. As the largest gathering of Confederate veterans since the Civil War, more than 40,000 attended the 1918 Tulsa Convention, celebrating Southern nostalgia and ideologies. Brady and other Tulsa leaders banded together to raise over $100,000 to cover the cost of the event. Reunion, that was $100,000 in 1918. Reunion visitors were treated to the best of Tulsa's marvels, tours to the oil fields, free trolley tickets, and lodging with modern day heated quarters. Although Tate Brady was the primary organizer of the reunion, its committee members included judges, ministers, and influential names that are still widely recognized in Tulsa and honored. I think it's really important to contextualize the Tulsa massacre and destruction of Greenwood into these preceding years and the repression that took place. I've thought a lot about mistakes that organizers made. I can certainly think of some, but I think nothing on earth could have resisted, not the most well-oiled revolutionary machinery could have survived this kind of repression, both from the federal government and the local. So this, to understand this apex of this gross atrocity of bombing and burning a whole city down, how it could happen, I think we have to look at that historical context, a very brief historical context. But that wealth was, it's called capitalism. But it also reveals the power of interethnic worker solidarity that existed. And that's what we need to learn from their success in actually creating under horrible conditions, being able to create that level of interethnic worker solidarity. And the very existence of the Black city of Greenwood and the autonomous Black and Native towns in eastern Oklahoma. It is no wonder that this period does not appear in our textbooks. With the June 2020 centennial of the destruction of Greenwood, for the first time, the whole world was watching Although Trump tried to pull attention away from the celebration by holding his own campaign rally in Tulsa that day, later, as Columbus statues were being toppled around the country on July 4th, Trump staged a campaign rally at Mount Rushmore, the giant token of land theft in the Black Hills, the sacred land of the Sioux and the Cheyenne. What followed was the Trumpist demonization of the Black Lives Matter-led uprising and of education that includes the study of racialized structures of the United States, with states passing legislation criminalizing such education, including in Oklahoma, where it is now illegal to even talk about the massacre and destruction of Greenwood as any kind of having any kind of racial relationship. I want to end by just, as I said in the beginning, I'm not an expert on Oklahoma history, but I was able to consult two very important books that I hope everyone can read. I put them in the chat also. Elena Roberts, whom I quoted, the Chickasaw Black professor. She's a professor at University of Pittsburgh. Her book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. It's the best book published on what I spoke about. And also David Chang's The Color of the Land, Race, Nation, and the Politics of Land Ownership in Oklahoma, 1822 to 1929. I'm also grateful for the work of the late Leroy Chapman and his deep research on the role of the Tulsa elite, particularly Tate Brady and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. You can Google him and find all of his articles, mostly in the journal The Land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. That was brilliant and really important. And I before we go to John, I just wanted to add, it's amazing how few amazing texts, incredible texts, actually don't mention the 1921 massacre. One being the very powerful book by James Green, on grassroots socialism, which deals with the IWW outrage, but doesn't deal with Tulsa at all. I mean, the 1921 massacre. Yeah. So I just think that what you contributed is so important to making these kinds of connections. And so now, John, you can take up the story from there.
Okay. Well, thank you. Again, the two of you, and Robin especially, for the wonderful introduction of Roxanne and me. Overpraise in my case, but and thanks also to the Cambridge Library and and the Center for Marxist Education and the other sponsors and connections that we have today. There are 5 points I want to at least mention and try to concentrate maybe on a couple toward the end. First, I would only emphasize what Roxanne made wonderfully clear, the complexity of Oklahoma history. Every state, when you get really into it, to the grit of it, is complicated, but Oklahoma may be uniquely complicated precisely for the reasons that Roxanne explained. It's really 2 Oklahomas. One is pretty simple. It's Western Oklahoma, and it runs all the way up to Canada. It's the same country, but you can practically see it from South Dakota. I drove through there once and I could see a storm in southern Kansas, which is probably well into Oklahoma. Eastern Oklahoma is something really very different. and Roxanne explained it wonderfully. It had grown hugely from the time that white population was admitted by the federal government to settle there. That population flooded mostly in the central Oklahoma, but a lot of people went into the eastern part as well because of the because railroads were already there. That was the first great industry, aside from cattle drives, before the railroads. It was the first great industry in Oklahoma, and it was cause and effect. They wanted it because Oklahoma and Arkansas had coal, and territory coal, as they called it, was exported all over. There were no coal mines past, I forget the name of the town in New Mexico, but you needed coal to get there. But territory coal was sold in Mexico as well, which didn't have much coal. So there was, the population in 1890 was something like 250,000. By 1920, it was 2 million. An overwhelming majority in the eastern half were these whites and blacks moving into into Indian nations, which already had, as Roxanne explained, its own complicated black population, tribal members. By something like 90% of Oklahoma, all told, in 1920 was white, 7% black, 3% Indian. But this misses, again, statewide, the East-West division. In the old Creek Nation, in the counties south and east of Tulsa County were about a third black. The Tulsa County itself and Tulsa City was about 10%. And those other three counties down between the Verdigris and the Arkansas River were a third black. And that was mostly where these 50 so black towns were. There was pressure in the early part of the century before statehood, but to create a black state or an Indian state. And if it had been an Indian state, it would have been considerably black. The politics of it was really strange. You have to go somewhat outside Oklahoma to understand it or to get a sense of it, because Girard, Kansas, just over the northeastern corner of Oklahoma and near the Kansas coal fields, was a center for socialist and pretty radical socialist agitation and organizing work, and eastern and western Arkansas as well. There were important movements in those areas. But a lot of it came out of the I don't want to hurry through some of this. There were both in agriculture and in, I think, manufacturing and mining. It's important to see that the railroads have brought the mining itself, coal, but also lead and zinc, northeast of Tulsa, up in the far corner, over into Kansas and Missouri. There were high prices, but also there was timber in southeastern Oklahoma, which goes down into Louisiana and northeast Texas. And after 1905, the huge oil booms that keep happening in Oklahoma. There you can see that there are class struggles going on in agriculture, agribusiness practically. And some of these go back into the 1840s. There was a black slave rebellion in the Creek Nation, where they tried to escape headed for Mexico. They didn't get even into Texas, but the Seminoles joined them on the way. And then again in 1849, there was a movement when they did get into Mexico. Some of those are slave revolts in Indian territory. As Roxanne explained, once you get the allotments of land to the private property, where they force the federal government imposes individualization of the tribal property into private property, and you then very quickly get struggles between tenant farmers and sharecroppers of all races, fighting separately and sometimes together against their landlords. In industry, there are powerful labor movements locally, at least, in mining and in smelting, refining, flour mills, sawmills, brickyards, and slaughterhouses. There were all told by 1920 something like 40,000 people in Oklahoma listed in the census in manufacturing. The main centers were in the center of the state, Oklahoma City, but the others were Tulsa and a couple of old Indian towns, Muskogee and Shawnee. The mining in the northeast corner it's the strangest part in a way of labor in Mexico. It was the workers themselves seemed to take it on themselves to resist unionization, maybe because of sort of some kind of Ozark anxiety about not wanting any outside interference. But in the West, there were powerful movements in the wheat country, the IWW. But the one that's interested me most, there are two really, in Eastern Oklahoma. One was in the mine workers, the coal country in southeastern Oklahoma, in Choctaw, in the Choctaw Nation. There were something like 7,000 miners there in 1920, and there were that was down from earlier. There had been something like 10,000 there 10 years before. It was both Creek and Choctaw nations in their country, now part of the state of Oklahoma, that they had organized District 21 of the United Mine Workers, which included Western Arkansas and Eastern Oklahoma. It was one of the most militant local districts in that union. They fought wars. They had dynamite. They worked with dynamite, and everybody was taking advantage of the Second Amendment. And so there was a war in western Arkansas in 1914 against a Standard Oil Company owned coal company that ended in a tremendous war after the massacre by the guard militia and guard in Ludlow, Colorado. The Prairie Creek miners who were, or the Eastern Arkansas miners who were on strike said that Ludlow's not going to happen here. The local in McAllister in Oklahoma sent him boxes of hundreds of rifles and ammunition and dynamite, and they had a battle. There were then you have the remarkable rise of the Socialist Party in Oklahoma. There were the yellow socialists, as they called them, in Wisconsin. And Oklahoma and New York were of all places, were the red socialists. The Debs campaigned there in 1912. Something like you had people, 2,000 people were out marching for him in Muskogee with red shirts. Muskogee is one of those towns that was an old Creek town. It was the Creek capital, and it was about a third Black. Those people were farmers, tenant farmers, sharecroppers, but they turned out for Debs, and not that they could vote, the Black ones, because of Oklahoma laws, but they were ready to support him. So the point that I want to, if there are 2 points really at the end here, I want to emphasize. One is that the war. Wilson had campaigned against the war in 1916, and then as soon as he took office, the United States, he pushes Congress, doesn't have to push him hard, nudge, an invitation, and the United States declares war, enters World War I, and the big thing really is the conscription. There were something like, in Oklahoma alone, 85,000 who enlisted or were conscripted into the armed forces. 60,000 of them white, but 20,000 of them Black. That's a considerable proportion, disproportion, and 5,000 Indian. That summer, in part, in August, in part because of the war, but also because of their background in the Socialist Party and their then the organization of the working class union, or their adoption of it as it had come out of the timber workers in Louisiana. It's worth a tiny detail. The guy who organized the Brotherhood of Timber Workers was a guy named Covington Hall, who belonged to the sons of the Confederate veterans, and at some point got to be a high-ranking officer. But he declared that his union was not going to be segregated. It was totally integrated. He was, I think, run out then of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. But that organization of timber workers in Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma had started in 1913 the working class union, which was not segregated and multiracial. And it was then reorganized in 1914 and continually organized as a lot of those people moved into Oklahoma and down up the Canadian River into Creek and Choctaw country, where a lot of these Indian Black Indian people lived and farmed. Also as sharecroppers and tenants. This working class union, in the article Roxanne and I did, make their attempt at a rebellion. They do actually gather, and it doesn't get very far, but it is it's something like 450 people are arrested, and I think over 100 of them convicted, and a number of them, 20 or so, spend some years in federal and state prisons. But then the war is really underway by that fall. and people are being sent off overseas. And it's in November then, in 1917, that the Tulsa outrage, so-called, happens, which Roxanne described, where what can you call them? The city fathers, or at least some of the city godfathers of Tulsa, captured easily the IWW leaders in Tulsa, trying to organize the oil fields, and tar and feather them, run them off. It's interesting. I looked up where the IWW had its office in Tulsa, and it was just across the street from Greenwood, about a block away on the north side of Tulsa. And along with that headline that Roxanne mentioned, modern KKK born. The next, that's the leader on the right. The leader on the left is about the Bolsheviks in Russia. And that begins then something very strange that I think everybody was smelling in that part of the country and elsewhere. Something that had to do with Black resistance and Bolsheviks, the possibility of Black rebellion and the world, their bourgeois white world coming apart. It's 1918, that Confederate reunion in Tulsa is really a sight. And I think it is absolutely, as Roxanne explained, wonderful detail, just the preliminaries for what begins to happen. It then congeals, I would say, with the organization of the American Legion in 1919. That is part of the sort of thirst for blood in the American bourgeoisie that is parallel, I think, to the organization of the fascist elements in Italy, just at the post-war Italy, and the Freikorps in Germany. Same kinds of guys, except in Germany they've been defeated, but they claim it's because of a socialist stab in the back. And in the United States, they're victorious. So you have a kind of triumphal white belligerence forming, sort of condensing out of the air. It's been there all along, but it's condensing in 1919. And then the Red Scare over the IWW and the prosecutions, all that year, and the Red Summer of 1919. There were, I think, I counted over 50. There are various articles about it. There are over 50 white invasions of Black neighborhoods in the United States through that summer. And they're in 20 states and the District of Columbia. Most of them are in Georgia, 9, and Mississippi, 5, what you'd expect. But there were 4 in Pennsylvania, 2 of them in Philadelphia that summer, and 2 of them in New York City, and 2 in New London, Connecticut. And that fall, Cyril Briggs organized the African Blood Brotherhood in Harlem. And they began to organize chapters elsewhere. In Oklahoma too, there are the strikes in the summer of 1917 in Muskogee, Drumright, and Tulsa in that summer. There's a national coal strike that begins in November 1919, and it has its strikes in Oklahoma as well, in the coal country there. It was so alarming to the state government that November, the governor called out the National Guard there and imposed martial law. So this smell of IWW Bolshevism is everywhere. And with the white press, there is a kind of a new fury as well, because of these Black veterans who are coming back from the Army, some of them from combat. There are photographs of Black veterans, of Oklahoma Black veterans in the Oklahoma archives, of them returning. And there's newspapers in Oklahoma are then scattered with stories of Black veterans who don't know their place anymore. So they're beginning in Armistice Day in 1919, the first anniversary of the armistice, is a time for this white chauvinism and white riots. So there's a tremendous riot in the state of Washington against the IWW and the murder and lynching of an IWW war veteran there. There are two lynchings in Oklahoma in 1920. One of a Black young man, Claude Chandler, in Oklahoma City, and one of a white young man, Roy Belton, in Tulsa. They were both probably criminals. Chandler was a bootlegger, and Belton had apparently stolen a taxi, but that's not a death sentence, much less by a mob, a white mob. It's clear that in Greenwood, once in 1921, then, well, let me go back. There are a couple other things here. Greenwood, as Roxanne explained, was heavily segregated. John Hope Franklin, who went there, grew up there really after his father thought it was safe to bring the family into the city. Described it as not just segregated, but totally separate. It was white downtown and south, and Black on the north side. It was in a way, self-segregated, as he said, and as W.B. Du Bois, who visited it also, said, that these people they had their own world. They were happy at it. They felt they were entitled to go into Tulsa, into the white Tulsa as they pleased, and that whites could come into Greenwood as they pleased, but they had built their own institutions on the grounds of the kind of economic stability that they had. But meanwhile, particularly during and after the war, the Tulsa newspapers, the two big white newspapers, just kept pressing this bourgeois white classist, racist agitation, and a dread of what they were already beginning to call Black Bolshevism. So the spark happens. This 19-year-old young Black man arrested for supposedly rape of a 17-year-old white girl in a public elevator, charge she later withdrew. Their anxieties, word begins to go around Tulsa thanks to the newspapers that very day, that there's going to be lynching. And one of the papers, I think it's the Tulsa World, says, "Get out the hemp." They don't mean weed. They mean the rope. And so you get white crowds gathering around the county jail where the sheriff was taking this young man. And at that point, the word has reached into Greenwood, 25 people, black men, armed, many of them veterans, come down to the courthouse. One of the great black entrepreneurs, probably the richest black guy in Stratford, says, what's the deal? The sheriff says, we'll work it out. The guy is safe and so on. So go home. They do, but then the white crowd gets bigger. 75 more black armed men turn up in the city in front of the courthouse. One of them, a big, tall guy with a weapon, a veteran, a white guy says to him, what are you doing with the pistol? And give it to me, and grabs at it, and the gun goes off. Everybody starts shooting everybody else. The story, you can read this all over the internet by now. But there is, the last thing I want to get into is what kind of massacre this was. It was clear. I mean, it was murder, manslaughter, assault, arson. And the Red Cross, which did a pretty good analysis of it soon afterwards, estimated that as many as 300 people died, and there were thousands wounded. But it's not only, I think, and they were very largely, of course, black, but it's not only a massacre. It was a massacre when the whites, the next morning, June 1st, invaded Greenwood and then set fire or bombed. A lot of the bombing is one thing, that's bad enough, but these were people going individually into houses, pouring gasoline on them and setting fire to them. From inside these houses, after they rifled everything they could carry off they thought they liked. And there are a few studies of the people who died and were wounded, or at least compilations of them. The total killed and wounded and identified, at least by color, that they counted at the time were 85. The total wounded that they counted at the time, they obviously missed lots of people, were 250. But the breakdown by color is interesting. Now the 85 counted as killed in action, 64 were black, 21 were white. The white people weren't shooting each other, except for one case where a white guy was mistaken somehow for a black man. Of the 250 wounded in action, 135 were black, 115 were white. In other words, this wasn't only a massacre, just one side slaughtering another side that was helpless. It was, I think, call it the Battle of Greenwood. Though the American Legion and its mob, proto-Klansmen, led by Klansmen who belonged to the Klan, though it wasn't belonged to the Klan nationally, though it wasn't yet formally organized in Oklahoma, though that mob won and that they destroyed Greenwood and killed all these people, drove thousands of them out of the city. The Black veterans and the African Blood Brotherhood, which had a chapter in Tulsa, gave them very bitter resistance. A great forensic anthropologist did some work on the death certificates that the Oklahoma State Commission retrieved in 1999, 2000, published in 2001. There were 39 death certificates. One was of a stillborn black baby that had been lost in the battle. Of the other 38, 13 were white, 25 were black. All died homicide, gunshot wounds. Of the 13 white, 11 were not from Oklahoma, but had moved there to work. 10 were single, separated, or divorced. 2 were married, 1 unknown in that regard. Of these 13, the occupations of 12 were known from the birth certificates. 3 were oil field workers. 1 was a boiler maker, 1 a machinist, another a salesman, an oil company office manager who got shot apparently by accident, a hotel clerk, 2 cooks, a high school student, and a common laborer. Another couple appear in the press, an auto repair shop and a railroad worker. Their mean age, all 13 of the whites have their age stated, and the mean age was 27. Of the 25 blacks, most were from Oklahoma. Marital status was blank for 17. Of the other 8, 5 were married, 3 single. The occupations, only 10 of the 25 were known. A surgeon, a realtor, a bank porter, an iceman, an elevator operator, 5 laborers, a tailor, a waiter, a chauffeur, a hotel manager, and a janitor, and 2 hotel porters were reported not on the death certificates, but in the press at the time. Of those 25 black dead killed in action, only 15 have ages noted. The others are estimated. And their mean age was 34. So you get a part of the picture. The white sample shows you mostly young, out-of-state, single working men. The black sample shows you mostly somewhat older, Oklahoma-born, Oklahoma-born and raised, married workers with a couple of professionals. I can't find any information about who was a veteran, but there were some veterans from Tulsa's African Blood Brotherhood at a national brotherhood rally in Harlem later in June 1921. And it's clear from that, it seems to me, I mean, they're there to testify to the crowds about what went on. Let me end there and there is an immense amount of work, historical work, still to do on that affair, to put it coldly. But it was a massacre. You could say it was sort of on a scale of, say, the massacre at the Battle of the Washita, where Custer wiped out something like 150 peaceful Cheyenne. It was on the scale, still on that scale of the American massacre of Vietnamese My Lai, 1968. About 500 unarmed people. It was on the scale of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. A lot of children and others, federal workers, were black. 168 at least, and all these don't count the people who suffered so tremendously from it and then died later on from associated connected causes. But it wasn't only a massacre. It was also a battle of resistance. These black veterans stood their ground. They actually thought they'd won by the middle of the night when the white crowd stopped at the Frisco tracks before they came across into Greenwood. It wasn't until the next morning when the city fathers had mobilized this tremendous force of whites, several thousands, to invade with fire and ammunition from the police to come into Greenwood and destroy it. But I would want to say that aside from the massacre, also and the black veterans did pretty well.
Okay, thank you. We have much to talk about. I'm jotting down some notes here. First of all, thank you so much for that, John. I was noticing just a couple things, some observations I made in your talk. One, you make this really convincing case for linking the revolutionary insurgencies in the US between 1917 and 1919 with what's happening with the Bolshevik Revolution, the Spartacus Uprising in Germany, the revolution in Hungary, and then also the roots of fascism being homegrown, that the Klan, the Knights of Liberty, the American Legion were all manifestations of fascism without having to borrow from Italy, Germany, or anywhere else. In fact, maybe the other way around. But it's also worth talking about, and I would pose a couple of questions for both of you, and then we're going to open it up. Just talking about the importance of xenophobia in mobilizing the populace against any threat to capital. But in the case of the Wobblies, as you know, from the 1917 outrages, that the Wobblies were identified as German sympathizers, German agents, and that helped mobilize opposition to them and justify the attacks. And this is also a period in which anti-sedition laws and anti-immigrant laws were passed simultaneously. All the Italians are anarchists. The Germans were not just Germans because they're on this other side of the First World War, but they were social democrats. You had this anti-Asian sedition, anti-sedition laws and anti-immigrant laws directed at Asians. And there's actually a really important book about to come out by Moon Ho Jung called Menace to Empire, which really looks at that. So I was wanting to lay that out there, but then ask one really basic question. No, actually, before I ask the question, let me just ask you to do something really simple, either one of you. In all of the conversations, I think it was taken for granted that people know what the Green Corn Rebellion was. But can one of you, because you've both written so eloquently about it, in a nutshell, just give a thumbnail sketch of that for people who may not know about it? We should all know, but I can't guarantee that we do, before we get into some other questions. Either one of you, because both of you know it's back and forth.
Jack, you do it.
Okay. Well, the Green Corn Rebellion grew out of the working class union as it was reorganized in Fort Smith in 1914 and came into Oklahoma, down up the Canadian Valley, through Creek and Choctaw country, then state of Oklahoma, mostly with tenant farmers and sharecroppers of all races as they were then. But also near coal mining towns farther south or along the way, like Henrietta and other such places. They tried at two conventions of the IWW to get the IWW to admit them. But the IWW said, no, you're not wage earners. You're poor, you work your rear end off all year round. Your children go hungry and don't go to school, and you're sick a lot of the time, but you don't earn a wage, and so you can't belong to the IWW. That confirmed them in the WCU, and it was then Wilson's war and Congress's war in the spring of 1917 that really broke the back of their, well, not their back, but broke the dam of their anger. Their kids had to register for the draft, and they were worried about that. There was a lot of them had come out of the sort of the lower Ozarks from Arkansas. And there had been resistance. They came, some of them, from families that had resisted the Confederate draft in the Civil War. They did not want to be, they had all the conflict they wanted with the landlords and the bankers and the towns where they tried to market their share of the crops. So through the summer of 1917, they began to organize, and in August of 1917, they actually did mobilize, probably all together in different parts of that Canadian Valley in eastern Oklahoma, maybe some 1,000 or more people ready to revolt with not much more than shotguns or 22 rifles. But they heard also through the IWW of struggles in other parts of the country, in timber country in the Northwest, and in docks and industries. And they, I think, they were not any of them particularly educated. Dr. Lefevre, who reorganized the WCU in Fort Smith, was a medical doctor, but he did mostly homeopathy. None of them had a political, they had their political experience, but they had very little political information and very little political connection. They knew about struggles elsewhere, but anyway, they tried to revolt. They gathered some hundreds in a couple places in the 3 or 4 areas in that part of Oklahoma, and tried to set railroad bridges afire. A good idea. Would stop the National Guard from coming in. They tried, somebody blew up a water tower, and there were a number of acts of strategic struggle to destroy infrastructure. But when it came to the final real battle, the sheriff's posses, somebody asked the governor, some of these county officials, to send the National Guard. Somebody advised him, no, that would only inflame things. So the sheriffs raised posses, and the posses came out, and most of the guys who had organized the main front on the top of a hill, basically it dissolved. So the thing lasted maybe all told something like 2 weeks, but it made a tremendous impact that summer, part because of years of the IWW. So the IWW was blamed for the working class union when it probably at that point would not have supported. So and when in the fall of 1917, the IWW was organizing oil fields. By that time, the WCU, the people from the WCU arrested and sent to trial were all, that was full of, Oklahoma newspapers were full of that. And then when the Bolsheviks appear on the front pages, it's clear that Bolshevism is everywhere. And so before IWW and Tulsa sort of stuck with being Bolshevik agents, and somehow violent bridge burning revolutionaries.
Right.
They and ready to bring capitalism down, but they had not moved in those directions.
Okay.
So,
Well, thank you. That's actually great. That's great. That's really helpful.
Robin,
I wanted to ask you to chime in, Roxanne, and I had a
yeah,
question for you.
just a couple of short things to add. I think the main reason these farmers were panicking was because of conscription.
Mhm.
My father was a tenant farmer and sometimes sharecrop, and they depend so much on the children, child labor, especially the teenage boys, so that these young men would be taken away from them. They would starve. The family would starve. They were extremely poor people. So it was a desperation, as well as the politics that came into it, which was really beautiful. That didn't exist in the 30s and 40s when my father was in that situation. But the other thing is, people may wonder why it's called the Green Corn Rebellion.
Right.
So I thought I would explain green corn.
Thank you.
In August is when the corn is green, just before it's going to turn yellow and be edible. And it is a sacred time for the Muskogee people. Actually, it began in Mexico. It's almost all of the South. It went everywhere, but it got condensed down to mainly the Muskogee, Creek and Seminole people. It's a sacred period of time, and they do dancing, the green corn dance, to make sure the crop is good, to come together for the beginning of harvest, and food, food for the fall, for the winter. So that's that really tips you off, I think, as to the power of the Native people who were involved, the Muskogee people who were involved. So it's usually put as a kind of anecdote that, well, they took the green corn to eat on the way, to occupy Washington, DC, which was their ultimate goal. They were going to pick up all the trade unionists. They were going through Louisiana and pick up all those workers and all over and go and take over the government of the United States. That was their stated goal. So these were, this wasn't just a localized uprising. And so I think that to me, just the fact they call it green corn and the ceremonies were going on tells of the importance of the Muskogee people in the idea and the leadership and the organizing.
Right. Yeah, my mom actually wrote a paper on the green corn ceremony when she was in graduate school. So before we open it up, there's a bunch of questions in the chat, which I'm going to bring in. But I wanted to ask you a question, Roxanne, specifically, like, how do we reconcile the story of Black freedmen, from the 5 indigenous nations, and their relationship to the conditions for limited prosperity on the one hand, as indigenous descendants, versus the story of Southern migrants or exodusters who used the Homestead Act, right, to also create these Black towns and to settle in there. Was there a tension between these communities? Did they create a different kind of alliance? Is there a way that those two stories also help explain, like, the Greenwood district?
I think so. I think it's probably very complicated and can't just be either or. But I do think there's a difference in, especially how Native people saw it. They didn't see the Black freedmen. I mean, there's plenty of tension, and of course the racism that grew in the 20th century. There's a lot of contention around, Black freedmen citizenship and sometimes being put off the rolls and then whether they can hold the presidency of tribes and so forth. But at the time, the Native people certainly would not have seen Black freedmen as settlers, as invaders, because they were already there. But people who came in as settlers under the Homestead Act, they were, whether Black or white, they were invaders on Native land. They were taking Native land. So I think that would be the difference, and probably the Black freedmen somewhat had the same view that these, even though there were interchanges, I think they had the views that these were different people. I mean, maybe, I'm not sure, how, but I think most Black Indians, being so steeped in the cultures of the Native nations that they were a part of, that they would not just say these are the same, we had slavery in common, yes, but culturally very, very different. And I think that's true today, of the Black freedmen descendants, that they're have very specific, I don't know, Beacon Press has published Kyle Miles' book, he's not a freedman, but he is half Ojibwe and half
exactly
Black, and that's a very interesting book.
It is. He happens to be my colleague at UCLA, Kyle.
Right.
So, and it's a terrific book, a great compliment to yours. Okay, so I'm looking at the time here. We only have 25 minutes, and I want to invite people to ask their questions in the chat. I also want to, I have my own questions, but I don't know if we have enough time, but there's a couple of really quick questions that came up in the chat. One was, where do the Osage people fit in this narrative?
Yes. That land I was talking about that the government took to give to at least to the Creek and Cherokees up in the Northeast, that was Osage land. Of course, the Osage territory was huge, and mostly grassland and farming, but a good hunk of it was taken, just appropriated, taken away from them. So that created tensions, of course. But of course, too, the kinds of things we talked about of blowing up oil wells and the cheating and all this, I think it's even better known that this went on in the Osage Nation to tragic results. There's a movie coming out and book, there's really a lot of information on that available. But the kind of treatment that happened after 1921, especially, was just horrible in the Osage Nation. Lots of murders, many more than any other Native people.
Exactly. Okay, so another question that came up is a comment, and I'm going to say a couple of words about it and then open it up for both of you to respond. But Michael Madden, made a point that in the report that Walter White issued about the events in Tulsa, the Tulsa massacre, I pointed out that there were 7 different airplanes that dropped bombs on the Greenwood district. And as Michael says, it speaks to the enormous, overwhelming enmity and sheer death dealing of the ruling forces in Tulsa. And thinking about aerial bombardment, I just wanted to add a couple of things and then invite you both. This is right after the so-called Great War, which was, one of the, it wasn't necessarily it was in terms of the use of technology, the most advanced up to that point use of technology to kill civilians in global history. But all that technology was used first on colonized people, aerial bombing. I mean, they were doing that against colonized people in Africa. Do you have, the Gatling gun used to mow down the Ashanti peoples, the Maxim gun killing thousands of Sudanese who revolt in the Matabele War in 1893. Certainly the Gatling gun was used to kill Cheyenne in Oklahoma, to kill during the Nez Perce War in 1877. I mean, all this modern technology and aerial bombardment being one of those parts of modern technology coming out of the First World War. So of course, it's going to be used against people like, like people of African descent and of indigenous descent in this region. And so I'm wondering if both of you have any thoughts about the specific use of aerial bombardment as a way of subjugating this, what John correctly calls a revolt. I mean, it was an act of self-defense that had to be suppressed. Either one of you could jump in.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jay.
The Oklahoma State Commission in 2001, one of the guys who has a short article on the airplanes, and he goes through all the airplanes that there were in Tulsa at the time. As I remember, there were something like only like 15. But clearly, well, there were, he argues, I don't think he's totally right, but he argues a lot of it was for surveillance, that they were flying over to see where Black people were going. I think that they, in their hysteria, the white guys, thought that these Black veterans had something much more organized to do, that they were going to, that they had much more armed, that it was much more dangerous. They talked continually that this was a Negro uprising. And I think some of them were probably truly alarmed that things were, that they were faced something much worse than they'd ever expected. And so at least it makes sense to me that some of the airplanes were up to that the city put them up, the police, and probably the National Guard used some to see where people were going and if there was anything worse about to happen. But there was so much testimony from the Black families and the Black population of Greenwood about these airplanes dropping stuff and fires started. I don't think, I mean, to me, it's somehow, I don't know why, but it's no less awful to think of somebody going into somebody's Black family's house, stealing a poor Black family's house, but a rich Black family's house where they thought there was something that valuable they could take. So they go in, rob everything they want, and then set fire to the curtains and the bed. And that's, but the airplanes, there's so much testimony that it seems to me the burden of proof is heavy on the people who deny that there was any bombing. There are so many people who are victims of it who say they saw the stuff fall, fire, and since in oil fields too, you use dynamite and nitroglycerin. You got to blow things loose down below. They knew in the oil fields and the oil companies knew how to use nitroglycerin. And so I don't think there was really an air campaign on Greenwood, but the fact that there were bombings and what people shot from airplanes makes sense to me, and I would accept it until somebody disproves it.
Okay, so that's the challenge. Roxanne, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, the Gatling, you mentioned, and all these armaments at that time that were specifically made, not so much for real, war, standing armies, but to kill, colonial, they're made for colonial violence, to kill natives. And I just add to, the ones that Gatling was used for was the Wounded Knee massacre. They put a big Gatling up, they got all the people down below, and this was the 7th Cavalry, Custer's Old Cavalry. It was a revenge act. And just, they were just sitting ducks in this, surrounded by soldiers and a Gatling gun, shooting them. So it was a horrific weapon. But I think bombing, most of us have never been under bombs, including me, although I came close once, but how terrifying, how terrorizing it is to have fire coming from the sky.
So could you imagine living, not you, but all of us here, what it means to live in Gaza, where it is an occurrence, systematic occurrence.
Absolutely.
But that's also part of the story that we're thinking about. Okay, so we have some other questions in the chat. Let me ask one question that is implied in a question in the chat, and then go to some other specific questions. I think this is the critical question for our whole conversation today, and that is that while we all, like both of your talks, really agree that there was an egregious lack of working class solidarity in response to the Tulsa massacre, and of course, part of the essay that you wrote in Monthly Review is in some ways a response to that question. And of course, white workers were certainly conscripted in waging the violence against the people living in Greenwood. But the question that I'm really curious about is, why do you think, I know there's a lot of failures, but why specifically do you think that working class organizations that were not necessarily predominantly Black or Indigenous failed? In other words, was it because the IWW had been kind of run out? Was it because the working class union had been crushed? And I asked that question, and I want to frame it by something that Peter Linebaugh had discovered when he found a Tulsa Tribune article just weeks after the massacre. And he sent this to me, and he says, quote, "The two races being divided," was a proposal to construct an industrial section where Greenwood, had been, and, whether or not they could hold on to the land. So he says that this proposal involved the two races being divided by an industrial section. And this will draw more distinctive lines between them and thereby eliminate the intermingling of lower elements of the two races, which in our opinion is the root of the evil which should not exist, which could apply one or two things. It could apply the mingling of the races is the potential for class solidarity, or the mingling of the races is just explosive. And then it's just a natural occurrence of tension and would lead to violence. Of course, one could be chimera, one could be the truth. And I'm just wondering, do you have an explanation for the failure of white workers and other workers to really come to the defense of the people in Greenwood? I know it may be an obvious question, but it may not be.
Well, I think we have to remember that by that time, there had been some 30 years of industrial union organizing in the East and in the West, and they were segregated. It was unusual in Oklahoma to have any interracial workers. So that for one thing is context, and forcing Black people to form their own unions, which they did, but also the virulent anti-Chinese unionism, especially in San Francisco. Jack London leading it, the Yellow Peril. So this was, like in 1912, 1910. So I think Oklahoma was, unusual, but I do think that there was a huge campaign to convert white workers, to bring them into whiteness, bring them into solidarity with the ruling class and the wealthy. that Woodrow Wilson, the year after he was elected, Birth of a Nation came out, and he screened it in the White House, and it was a blockbuster. It was the first blockbuster in theaters all over the country. That was a propaganda film to convert white people to terror of Black people. And film buffs will tell you to no end how technically brilliant Birth of a Nation, especially at UCLA, how technically brilliant it is. And it is, it's the best, it's excellent propaganda. It meets the standards of today, for effectiveness. So I think we have to realize that from the White House was this, this huge campaign to make sure that workers did not unite, and that they would be divided by race. But I think the mistake, it was also in Oklahoma. They the Socialist Party, the IWW did have some Black workers, but it was mainly, they didn't go out of their way to organize Black workers. And a part of it was, they had to be wage workers, but also they were focusing, and they were the first ever to focus on migrant workers. They had a whole system of being able to travel around, and workers went from place to place all over the West, especially. So these unions were not. These organizations. I think the WCU was definitely somewhat different in the Louisiana, those experiences. But I think by 1921, there was at least a critical mass of white workers that had psychologically and ideologically joined, and partly seeing competition. There was also a lot of unemployment and poverty, that the fewer people they could have, organized, the better. And how, cutting off Black people or Chinese made them, and you saw in the 20th century, even Cesar Chavez doing that with immigrant, with undocumented at first, refusing to allow them to be in the United Farm Workers Union. So
Yes,
capitalist produced unions have, not done very well, and they haven't grown workers' movements
right.
in this country.
Yeah. Well, before I turn to John for this question, let me just throw one thing in there, because you raised a lot of points, Roxanne, and I was just going to add, in relationship to a lot of the questions about the African Blood Brotherhood, one of the arguments been made, and I think sometimes the ABB its size has been exaggerated, in terms of how many chapters and how many people, but it's important to, in terms of everything you mentioned, Roxanne, for all the people here on this call to remember, the Communist Party founded, the US Communist Party, which was basically two parties initially, founded in 1919. And in fact, it was the Third International was the first to really say, Black workers are not just like all the other workers, that we've got to deal with this question of race. And this was in the formation around this time. So by 1921, the Communist Party had a position on Black workers, which you can't say the same thing for the socialists in terms of an explicit position. And then 1922, around that time, sometimes people say earlier, the African Blood Brotherhood all joined the Communist Party. So to sort of make the distinction between the African Blood Brotherhood and the Communist Party, I'm not saying it's a false distinction, but it's one that has to be understood, that they're in solidarity with each other. And that is where I get stuck, because I'm like, well, you would think that 1921, if there was ever a radical kind of white working class response and defense of the people of Tulsa, you would think that would be the time it would happen, and it didn't quite happen. Now, John, what are your thoughts on all this? Just curious.
It's a huge, complicated question. If there, I think, industrialization that in the United States, that race has been the biggest, deepest problem for working people because white culture of living only around whites and in the South dreading among white working people that they'll have to live near blacks, that it's the worst problem in the American working class and class struggle and the labor movement. It is true, as I think Roxanne mentioned, that the Socialist Party and the IWW did make a point of, well, I wouldn't even put it that way. They said, you know, you can be black and a socialist. We're all for workers. But they didn't, as I think you, Robin, or she put it, they didn't go out of their way for it. I don't, considering everything else that they were trying to do, you could say, well, that was an error. But to try to, they should have done more. They should have been more open-minded. Why weren't they as enlightened as the Communist Party was after the Comintern suggested that they really better do something about this, that it was such a huge problem. So there are always little flickers of it that probably don't mean more than that, just a flicker. But as I remember, and John Hope Franklin's father's book that Franklin and his brother edited, he talks about, he mentions that there were two veterans there at the courthouse, young guys, one white and one black, and they're talking about how to organize a retreat and get back to defend Greenwood. We will probably never know who they were. But that is the kind of thing that I think was just, it was possible, but so because of American history. It was possible in a few tiny cases. If it hadn't been for the Comintern, Lord knows when the U.S. Communist Party would have eventually made a special organizing effort to get black workers or to open up to more than wage earners, to poor working people who maybe weren't making a wage. So it's the problem, the errors that what he suggested we consider in the beginning seemed to be basically the errors of American history or North American history. It's just a terrible history where working people find it so hard to get together because of, but there are cases where they do. The Caspian Sea, that southern part of Georgia, of the old Soviet Union, where Georgian, Armenian, Tatars, they called them at the time, now we call them Azerbaijani, and others managed somehow to work together and to create a tremendous revolutionary movement in that Trans-Caucasus. In the United States, because of American history, that's the explanation. It's very hard. And until something that happens that doesn't make it so hard, it's going to be just continual organizing and organizing.
That's right. That's right, continue organizing and organizing. And you just heard it here, two great historians of a terrible history, who know exactly how terrible it is and also know what it takes to reverse that, to transform it and to move us to another place. We've got 2 minutes. I want to invite Wali Halabi to maybe close us out with a few words. And I just want to thank both of our amazing guests for sharing their knowledge with us this afternoon. And I just so appreciate the both of you and also everyone who's participated today. So thank you. And Wali, do you want to come in?
Oh, I'm blown away by today's discussion and so grateful to the three of you for it. Almost a follow-up in terms of investigation, for example, from in the wake of Tulsa 1921 is the degree, the ability to bounce back from 1921. For example, in the great International Labor Defense Campaign, Scottsboro campaign, was the ILD, was the effort in Oklahoma weaker than, say, in neighboring states or across much of the South? Or was there a recovery? And in terms of rebuilding working class unity around Scottsboro. So it's really pointing to assessing that ability of workers to unite despite what the ruling class is pulling against that effort. But wow, this was an extraordinary discussion and exceptionally so well informed, and cannot thank you, the three presenters, enough, and also two other centers that sponsored this, Claudia Jones School and Legal Proctor in terms of today's event. And hopefully we can have a follow-up to this after you all recover from what we did today. So, thank you so much. Yeah.